Imagine a world not of clashing swords and burning castles, but of quiet conversations in candlelit chambers, where the fate of empires was decided not by the strength of armies, but by the careful choice of words on parchment. This is the hidden reality of medieval Europe, a place where some of the most dramatic power shifts in history happened without a single drop of blood being spilled. We often picture the Middle Ages as an era of endless war, of knights in armor and epic sieges, but behind the scenes, a different kind of power was at work, one wielded by diplomats, scribes, and strategic thinkers who knew that sometimes the pen truly is mightier than the sword. These master negotiators crafted agreements so subtle and yet so profound that they silently redrew the map of continents, redirected the flow of wealth, and redefined what it meant to hold power, all while avoiding the chaos and destruction of open conflict. Today, we're going to uncover 25 of these extraordinary silent treaties, each one a testament to the art of diplomacy and the timeless human desire to shape the world through wisdom rather than warfare. You'll discover how marriage alliances between royal families could unite kingdoms overnight, how trade agreements opened up new economic empires without a single battle, and how clever territorial exchanges prevented decades of war. These weren't just dry documents. They were living, breathing instruments of change that altered the course of history in ways we're still feeling today. From the division of Charlemagne's empire to the agreements that set the stage for the age of exploration, these treaties show us that the most lasting victories often come not from force, but from foresight, negotiation, and a willingness to find common ground. This journey into the past is more than just a history lesson. It's an invitation to see the world and the art of influence in a completely new light. As we explore these hidden turning points, you'll gain insight into the strategies and mindsets that allowed rulers to expand their realms, secure their legacies, and sometimes even save their people from the horrors of war, all through the quiet stroke of a pen. You might just find that these medieval lessons in diplomacy have surprising relevance for our own times, reminding us that even in an age of complexity and conflict, there are ways to build, to connect, and to reshape the world without destruction. So settle in and let's step back into a time when the most powerful moves were often the silent ones, and discover how 25 treaties changed everything without ever drawing a sword. But to truly grasp the genius of these silent power plays, we must first step into the mindset of a medieval ruler. Forget the image of modern diplomacy with its sterile conference rooms and standardized protocols. This was a world where a king's word was his bond, sealed not just with wax and parchment, but with sacred oaths, lavish gifts, and the intimate ties of marriage. The personal was political in the most profound sense. A dynastic union, for instance, was far more than a romantic match. It was a brilliant, long-term strategic maneuver. By marrying his daughter to a rival's son, a ruler could effortlessly weave together two powerful families, merging bloodlines, territories, and military resources, effectively creating a new superstate overnight without a single casualty. These weren't just alliances. They were organic mergers and acquisitions that could secure peace for generations or quietly neutralize a potential enemy by making them part of the family. Beyond the altar, the exchange of envoys was its own delicate art form. These were not merely messengers, they were trusted advisors, skilled linguists, and astute observers, chosen for their wisdom and their ability to navigate the complex web of courtly etiquette. Their mission was to read the subtle tensions in a foreign court, to negotiate terms face to face, and to present offers that balanced blatant self-interest with the essential veneer of mutual respect and honor. And then there were the scribes, the often unsung architects of these new realities. With every carefully chosen Latin phrase, they were literally drafting the future, translating verbal agreements into binding legal documents that would dictate borders, trade rights, and succession laws for centuries to come. A single clause, a clever ambiguity, or a precise definition could determine the fate of millions, making their role one of immense quiet power. Adding another layer to this intricate dance was the ever-present influence of the Church. The Pope and high-ranking clergy often acted as the ultimate mediators, their authority transcending national borders. A papal legate could bring warring Christian factions to the table, not with threats of military force, but with the spiritual weight of excommunication or the promise of divine favor. This religious dimension meant that diplomacy wasn't just about land and money. It was also about souls, salvation, and the perceived will of God, making these negotiations incredibly complex and emotionally charged. Understanding this rich tapestry woven from threads of family, faith, commerce, and law is essential. It reveals a sophisticated system where influence was expanded not just through the roar of battle, but through the whispered deal, the shrewd marriage, and the impeccably drafted treaty, setting the stage for the astonishing agreements we are about to uncover. Picture the immense Carolingian Empire, a sprawling territory that stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into Central Europe, suddenly left without its legendary architect, Charlemagne. His passing created a power vacuum so vast and destabilizing that it threatened to tear his life's work apart through internal warfare. The empire, which had been painstakingly united by military conquest and sheer force of will, now faced its greatest challenge not from external enemies, but from within its own ruling family. Charlemagne's grandsons Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald found themselves locked in a tense standoff, each holding a legitimate claim to the throne and each commanding the loyalty of powerful factions. The stage was set for a devastating civil war, one that could have consumed the entire continent in a prolonged and bloody struggle for supremacy. Armies were mobilized, alliances were tested, and the very future of European civilization seemed to hang in the balance. Yet, rather than march to battle, the three brothers chose a different path. They gathered at Verdun, a town in what is now northeastern France, to negotiate a settlement. This decision alone was revolutionary. In an era where might typically made right, and where disputes between rulers were usually settled on the battlefield, they opted for dialogue and compromise. The agreement they forged did not simply assign them individual titles within a single empire. It physically divided the vast Carolingian territories into three separate and distinct kingdoms. Lothair received the Middle Francia, a long, central strip of land running from the North Sea down through Italy. Louis the German took East Francia, the lands largely east of the Rhine River. And Charles the Bald was granted West Francia, the territory that makes up much of modern France. This tripartite division was far more than a simple family arrangement. It was a geopolitical earthquake whose aftershocks would be felt for 1,000 years. The Kingdom of East Francia would gradually evolve into the Holy Roman Empire, and later the core of what we now know as Germany. West Francia became the foundation of the French monarchy and the modern French state. And while Lothair's Middle Kingdom, often called the Lotharingia, would prove less stable and eventually be absorbed by its neighbors, its existence planted the early seeds for the many states that would later emerge in the Low Countries, Switzerland, and northern Italy. The Treaty of Verdun effectively drew the rough blueprint for Western Europe's future. Perhaps its most profound legacy, however, was the powerful precedent it set. For the first time in the post-Roman world, a major imperial succession was managed not through violence and conquest, but through careful negotiation and mutual agreement. It demonstrated that rulers could redraw the map of power without resorting to the sword, that diplomacy could be a tool every bit as potent as military force. This idea that complex political problems could have peaceful, negotiated solutions would echo through the centuries, influencing how medieval rulers approached everything from border disputes to dynastic crises. The treaty proved that even in a world dominated by warrior kings, the quiet art of negotiation could achieve what armies sometimes could not, laying a lasting foundation for the silent treaties that would continue to reshape the medieval world. But the division at Verdun, while groundbreaking, was only the beginning of the story. The borders it created were more like rough sketches than finished maps, and the balance of power it established remained fragile and open to reinterpretation. This instability became painfully clear just a few decades later with the death of Lothair II, the ruler of that vulnerable middle kingdom known as Lotharingia. His passing without a legitimate male heir was the spark that threatened to reignite the very conflict Verdun had sought to extinguish. His uncles, Charles the Bald of West Francia and Louis the German of East Francia, now saw not a tragedy but an opportunity, a chance to carve up their nephew's rich lands between them. The stage was set for another potential civil war, a bloody scramble for the spoils that could have undone all the progress made at Verdun. Instead of mobilizing their armies, however, these seasoned rulers chose to return to the negotiating table. They met at Meerssen in the modern-day Netherlands to settle the matter with parchment and ink rather than swords and shields. The treaty they crafted was a masterclass in pragmatic, if ruthless, realpolitik. They agreed to simply divide Lothair II's entire kingdom, slicing the territory of Lotharingia in two along the Meuse River. Charles the Bald took the western portion, incorporating it into his West Frankish realm, while Louis the German absorbed the eastern lands into his growing East Frankish kingdom. This was not a minor border adjustment. It was a massive, wholesale redistribution of territory and people, all accomplished through a single, silent agreement. The immediate effect was the avoidance of a devastating war. By satisfying the territorial ambitions of both kings through negotiation, the Treaty of Meerssen prevented the kind of fratricidal conflict that had plagued the Carolingian dynasty for generations. But its long-term consequences were even more profound. This second Great Partition accelerated the political fragmentation of Europe. The already weakened idea of a unified Carolingian empire was dealt a near-fatal blow as power continued to flow away from a single central authority and into the hands of regional kings. The treaty actively strengthened the foundations of what would become the kingdoms of France and Germany, giving them more coherent and defensible territories while systematically dismantling the buffer zone that had once existed between them. Furthermore, the deal at Meerssen had a cascading effect on local power structures. With a distant and weakened emperor, local lords and counts found themselves with greater autonomy. They began to build their own castles, raise their own armies, and administer their own justice, laying the essential groundwork for the feudal system that would dominate the High Middle Ages. The treaty's subtle reallocation of lands like Lorraine and Provence didn't just change the names on a map. It actively encouraged this shift towards localized power and decentralized governance. It proved that a diplomatic agreement, even one focused on the division of a single inheritance, could set in motion vast social and political transformations, quietly paving the way for an entirely new era of European history defined not by empires, but by a complex patchwork of feudal obligations and regional loyalties. Now, while the Carolingian rulers were using treaties to divide an empire across the English Channel, a different kind of threat demanded a completely different diplomatic solution. The Viking Age was in full, terrifying swing, and the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England were being systematically dismantled by Norse armies. One by one, the great kingdoms of the Heptarchy, Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, had fallen under the control of the great heathen army. By the 880s, only the kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, remained as the last bastion of independent Anglo-Saxon rule. It was a desperate, seemingly hopeless situation, with Alfred's realm constantly under threat of invasion and annihilation. He knew that a direct military confrontation against such a powerful and mobile enemy was a tremendous gamble. So he turned to a more subtle yet profoundly effective weapon, not a sword but a wedding ring. Alfred's masterstroke was the strategic marriage of his eldest daughter, Ethelfled, to Ethelred, the ruler of what remained of English-controlled Mercia. Ethelred was not a king in his own right, but held the title of Lord of the Mercians, governing a much-reduced territory that was technically under Viking dominance but fiercely resistant. This was not a marriage of mere convenience or romantic alliance. It was a calculated act of high statecraft. By binding his family to the most powerful noble in the neighboring kingdom, Alfred accomplished in a single ceremony what would have taken years of costly warfare to achieve. He effectively merged the military resources and strategic interests of Wessex and Mercia, creating a united front against the common Norse enemy, without ever having to issue a formal declaration of war. The impact of this marital pact was immediate and multifaceted. Militarily, it transformed the defense of England. Instead of two weak, squabbling kingdoms defending their own separate borders, Alfred and his new son-in-law could now coordinate their strategies, share intelligence, and combine their forces. Ethelfled, who would later be known to history as the Lady of the Mercians, proved to be a brilliant military leader in her own right, working in tandem with her father and later her brother to design and build a network of fortified towns or burhs across Mercia and Wessex. This interconnected system of strongholds created a defensive shield that Viking armies found incredibly difficult to penetrate, systematically blunting their ability to raid and conquer. Politically, the union was a genius move in soft power. It fostered a sense of shared identity and common cause between the West Saxons and the Mercians, two groups with a long history of rivalry and conflict. The marriage signaled that this was not a conquest of Mercia by Wessex, but a partnership of equals against a dire threat. This careful diplomacy prevented resentment and ensured Mercian loyalty, which was crucial for long-term stability. Culturally, it began the slow process of blending traditions and administrative practices, laying the essential groundwork for the idea of a single, unified English kingdom. The children of this generation would grow up thinking of themselves not merely as Mercians or West Saxons, but as English people defending their homeland. Ultimately, the marriage pact between Alfred and Ethelred did more than just win a few battles. It set in motion the entire political unification of England. The alliance held strong under Ethelfled's remarkable leadership after her husband's death, and the cooperative resistance she and her brother, King Edward the Elder of Wessex, mounted against the Vikings allowed them to systematically recapture the Danelaw territories. This process of reconquest and integration, built upon the foundation of that initial marriage alliance, directly paved the way for the creation of a single kingdom of England under their nephew, Ethelstan. Alfred's decision to use a dynastic marriage instead of outright conquest proved that the most durable power structures are often built not on force, but on the far stronger foundations of family, mutual interest, and strategic foresight. Now shift your focus from the battlefields of England to the heart of a very different kind of conflict, one fought not with axes and shields, but with edicts and excommunications. For over half a century, the very fabric of Christendom was being torn apart by the Investiture controversy, a monumental struggle between the two most powerful figures in medieval Europe, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. At its core was a seemingly simple question: who had the ultimate right to appoint bishops and abbots? But this question was a powder keg. To the emperor, these high church officials were not just spiritual leaders. They were powerful feudal lords controlling vast estates, levying taxes, and raising armies. Appointing a loyal bishop meant securing a key province. For the Pope, however, this practice, known as lay investiture, was an intolerable violation of spiritual independence, a corrupting influence that placed the soul of the Church in the hands of secular rulers. This wasn't just a political dispute, it was a fundamental clash of ideologies that led to emperors deposing popes, popes excommunicating emperors, and a continent-wide standoff that paralyzed both church and state. The resolution to this existential crisis did not come from a decisive victory on one side or the other, but from a brilliantly crafted compromise negotiated in the German city of Worms in 1122. The Concordat of Worms, as it came to be known, was a masterstroke of diplomatic ingenuity. It acknowledged the complex, dual nature of a bishop's role in medieval society and created a clear public process to separate his two sources of power. The agreement stipulated that the emperor would relinquish the symbolic act of investing a bishop with the ring and crozier, the sacred objects representing his spiritual office. This right was reserved for the Pope or his representatives. In return, the emperor retained the crucial right to bestow the temporal lands and titles that came with the bishopric, and to receive from the new bishop the homage and feudal obligations owed by any other vassal. This elegant separation of powers was far more than a bureaucratic technicality. It was a revolutionary recalibration of medieval authority. By formally dividing the spiritual from the secular, the Concordat silently but dramatically limited the emperor's ability to control the church directly, enhancing the political and moral authority of the papacy. It was a classic case of a compromise where both sides could claim a measure of victory. The Pope secured the principle of spiritual independence, a foundational win for the Church's sovereignty. The emperor, while conceding symbolic ground, maintained a vital practical influence over his most important vassals, preserving the stability of his realm. The ripple effects of this silent treaty were profound and long-lasting. By strengthening the papacy as an independent political force, the Concordat indirectly empowered the emerging nation-states of Europe. Kings and princes could now more effectively play the Pope and Emperor against each other, leveraging papal support to assert their own independence from imperial overlordship. Furthermore, the very act of successfully negotiating such a complex ideological dispute set a powerful precedent. It demonstrated to all of Europe that even the most bitter and entrenched conflicts, those touching on the deepest matters of faith and power, could be resolved through dialogue and a willingness to find a middle ground. The Concordat of Worms stands as a towering example of how a single, well-crafted agreement could diffuse a continent-wide crisis, proving that the most enduring power is often not seized by force, but carefully negotiated into existence. Yet, even as the Concordat of Worms was bringing peace to church and empire, a very different kind of chaos was consuming England, a period so brutal and lawless that it would later be known simply as the Anarchy. For 19 long years, the kingdom was torn apart by a vicious civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, King Stephen, who held the crown, and Empress Matilda, the daughter of the previous king, who believed it was rightfully hers. This wasn't a war of neat battle lines and chivalrous combat. It was a sprawling, bloody free-for-all where barons switched sides for profit, private castles sprouted like poisonous mushrooms across the countryside, and chroniclers wrote despairingly that Christ and his saints slept. The entire framework of royal authority, so carefully built by kings like Alfred and William the Conqueror, seemed to be crumbling into dust, replaced by the arbitrary rule of local warlords. The nation was exhausted, bled dry, and desperate for an end to the suffering that had brought neither side a clear victory. It was into this landscape of utter weariness that the Treaty of Winchester was born in 1153. This was not an agreement forged from a position of overwhelming strength by one side, but rather a pragmatic admission of stalemate by both. The crucial, brilliant compromise at its heart was the agreement that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but that upon his death, the crown would pass not to any of his own sons, but to Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet. In one masterful stroke, this solved the intractable problem of succession that had fueled the entire conflict. Stephen secured his reign and his dignity, avoiding the humiliation of being forcibly deposed. Matilda, while never becoming queen herself, saw her bloodline and her cause triumph, ensuring her son would inherit the throne. It was a perfect example of a diplomatic solution where both parties could walk away with their core interests intact, prioritizing the stability of the realm over the vanity of total victory. The immediate impact was the silencing of swords. The treaty effectively dissolved the primary reason for the fighting, allowing the weary barons and a traumatized populace to lay down their arms and begin the long, slow process of rebuilding their shattered lives and land. But the true genius of the Treaty of Winchester was not just in ending a war, it was in the future it so carefully engineered. When Stephen died just a year later, Henry II ascended to the throne unchallenged, seamlessly unifying the rival claims and founding the mighty Plantagenet dynasty. This smooth transition of power was the treaty's greatest gift to England. It provided the stable foundation upon which Henry, one of England's most formidable administrative geniuses, could build. Unburdened by the immediate need to fight a civil war, Henry II launched a series of sweeping reforms that would radically reshape English governance. He sent royal judges on regular circuits across the country, taking the king's justice directly to the people and beginning the standardization of what would become English common law. He developed the system of writs and jury trials, reducing the reliance on brutal trial by combat or ordeal. He began to assert greater control over the church and the nobility, systematically dismantling the illegal castles that had been the strongholds of anarchic baronial power during the previous decades. None of this would have been possible without the peace and legitimacy bestowed by the Treaty of Winchester. It proved that a negotiated peace could do more than just stop the bleeding. It could create the conditions for a period of incredible institutional innovation and state building, demonstrating that the most profound victories for governance are often won not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, reasoned space of a diplomatic agreement. Meanwhile, the dramatic saga of the Byzantine Empire presented a challenge of a completely different nature. For over half a century, the magnificent capital of Constantinople, the legendary Queen of Cities, had been a prize held not by its rightful heirs but by Latin crusaders. The Fourth Crusade's shocking diversion and sack of the city in 1204 had shattered the ancient empire, scattering its leadership and people into rival successor states. The most powerful of these was the Empire of Nicaea, a government in exile that saw itself as the true guardian of Byzantine tradition and the only legitimate claimant to the imperial throne. But reclaiming Constantinople was a monumental task. The city was one of the most heavily fortified in the world, protected by its legendary walls and a Latin garrison. A direct assault would be incredibly costly, likely resulting in a bloody siege that could destroy the very city they sought to liberate and leave the Nicaean forces weakened and vulnerable. The ruler, Michael VIII Palaiologos, needed a different kind of strategy, one that could unlock the city's gates without a catastrophic military confrontation. His solution was a masterclass in strategic outsourcing, a deal that traded economic opportunity for military might. He turned to the maritime Republic of Genoa, a rising commercial power locked in a fierce, generations-long rivalry with Venice, who were the primary backers and beneficiaries of the Latin regime in Constantinople. Michael offered the Genoese an offer they simply could not refuse. In the Treaty of Nymphaeum, signed in 1261, he promised Genoa what they coveted most: unparalleled commercial dominance in the Black Sea and the Aegean. The treaty granted Genoese merchants exclusive rights to trade throughout the recovering empire, free from tariffs and taxes. They were given their own autonomous merchant quarter in Constantinople, a virtual city within a city where they could govern their own affairs by their own laws. Most importantly, they were granted access to the ports of the Black Sea, opening up the incredibly lucrative trade routes to the fabled lands of the Silk Road. In exchange for this economic empire, the Genoese agreed to provide what the Nicaeans lacked: a powerful navy. Their fleet, one of the best in the Mediterranean, would blockade Constantinople, cutting off Latin reinforcements and supplies by sea, effectively strangling the city into submission. The result was a breathtakingly efficient and nearly bloodless reconquest. With the Genoese fleet controlling the sea lanes, the strategic situation for the Latin Emperor Baldwin II became utterly hopeless. Isolated and unable to receive help from his Venetian allies or from the west, his position was untenable. When a small, elite Nicaean force managed to find an unguarded section of the land walls and slip into the city, they faced little resistance. The Latin regime, drained of resources and morale, simply collapsed. Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople not as a conqueror leading a triumphant army, but as a restorer welcomed into his own home. The Byzantine Empire was reborn, and it had been achieved not through a decade of siege and the ruin of the city, but through a single, shrewd commercial treaty. The long-term consequences of this silent agreement were profound and twofold. For the Byzantines, the restoration was a miraculous resurrection, but it came with a heavy, hidden price. They had traded away their economic sovereignty to pay for their political freedom. The generous concessions to Genoa meant the empire's treasury would forever miss out on vital customs revenue, weakening its financial foundation for centuries to come. For Genoa, the treaty was an unqualified triumph. It catapulted them to the forefront of Mediterranean commerce, allowing them to overtake their hated Venetian rivals and establish a vast trading network that would generate immense wealth for the Republic. The Treaty of Nymphaeum stands as a perfect example of high-stakes geopolitical barter, where the currency was not gold or silver, but access and privilege. It demonstrated with stunning clarity that a well-crafted commercial alliance could achieve what armies could not, silently transferring the levers of economic power and reshaping the political map of an entire region without a single major battle being fought. While the Treaty of Nymphaeum demonstrated the power of economic incentives to reshape empires on the Iberian Peninsula, a different kind of challenge required a more grounded diplomatic solution. For centuries, the shifting frontier between the emerging kingdoms of Portugal and Castile had been a source of constant, low-grade tension. This was not a clearly defined line on a map, but a vast, contested borderland where local lords, knights, and towns often found their loyalties tested and their lands claimed by two competing crowns. The disputed town of Olivenza, in particular, was a recurring flashpoint. a place where minor skirmishes and legal disputes could easily escalate into a full-blown war between neighbors who shared a common language, culture, and even a common enemy in the Muslim south. It was a classic recipe for perpetual conflict, a territorial ambiguity that threatened to drain the resources and focus of both young kingdoms at a critical time in their development. Recognizing this danger, two forward-thinking monarchs decided to replace uncertainty with permanence. King Denis of Portugal and King Ferdinand IV of Castile, both pragmatic rulers more interested in building than battling, met in the small frontier town of Alcañices in 1297. Their goal was audaciously simple yet profoundly difficult: to do what few medieval rulers had ever managed to achieve: define an international border with exacting precision, once and for all. The treaty they produced was a masterpiece of clarity and compromise. It didn't just make vague promises of peace, it meticulously listed dozens of frontier towns, villages, and landmarks, explicitly assigning each one to either Portugal or Castile. The thorny issue of Olivenza was settled definitively in Portugal's favor, removing a persistent irritant from the relationship. In one sweeping document, a fuzzy, dangerous frontier was transformed into a clear, mutually recognized international boundary. But the Treaty of Alcañices was far more than a simple surveyor's report. It was a multi-layered pact designed to build a lasting peace. To cement the new political reality, it was accompanied by a series of strategic marital alliances, weaving the royal families of Portugal and Castile together through marriage. This personal union of blood and duty transformed the relationship from one of mere non-aggression into a genuine partnership, creating a vested interest in maintaining stability on both sides of the new border. The treaty also included crucial guarantees for the populations of these borderlands, ensuring that people who suddenly found themselves on a different side of a national line would not lose their property rights or be treated as aliens in their own homes. This humane consideration prevented the social dislocation that often accompanied such partitions, and fostered a sense of security and compliance among those most directly affected. The long-term impact of this silent agreement is nothing short of remarkable. It established the general configuration of the modern Portugal-Spain border, making it one of the oldest, most stable frontiers in all of Europe. For centuries, while the rest of the continent was convulsed by wars over succession and territory, the Iberian Peninsula enjoyed an unprecedented period of peaceful coexistence between its two Western powers. This stability was the treaty's greatest gift. Freed from the constant need to guard their western flank, both Portugal and Castile were able to turn their attentions inward to the vital work of state-building, consolidating royal authority, and developing their unique national identities. More spectacularly, they could look outward. The security provided by the Treaty of Alcañices created the necessary conditions for the era of exploration that would soon follow. Just over a century later, with its borders secure and its resources focused, Portugal, under the descendants of King Denis, would lead the age of discovery, sending its caravels down the coast of Africa and into the unknown Atlantic. This world-changing venture was built, in no small part, upon the foundation of a quiet, pragmatic treaty that chose the certainty of a map over the chaos of the battlefield, proving that defining a border can be the first step to discovering new worlds. Yet, even as the kings of Portugal and Castile were peacefully settling their European borders, their sailors were unlocking a far greater and far more dangerous dilemma on the high seas. The late 15th century was a time of breathtaking maritime breakthroughs. Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, had stumbled upon a vast and unsuspected new world in the West, while Portuguese navigators like Bartolomeu Dias were boldly rounding the southern tip of Africa, opening a sea route to the immense wealth of the Indies. These discoveries instantly created a monumental problem. Two rival Catholic kingdoms, both fueled by evangelical zeal and insatiable greed, were now on a collision course, their expanding spheres of influence destined to clash over uncharted territories and unimaginable riches. The potential for a catastrophic war between Europe's two foremost naval powers was very real, a conflict that could shatter Christendom and bleed both nations dry before they could even properly claim their prizes. They needed a referee, an authority both would respect, to draw a line down the middle of the unknown world and definitively say what was whose. That authority was found in the Vatican, in the formidable figure of Pope Alexander VI, a man known as much for his political cunning as for his spiritual office. In 1493, he issued a papal bull known as Intercitura, which established a demarcation line 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the west of this north-south line was granted to Spain. Everything to the east was reserved for Portugal. On the surface, this was a brilliant and peaceful solution, an act of papal arbitration that prevented an immediate war. But the Portuguese were furious. They argued that the line was too close to their territory and severely limited their ability to sail west into the Atlantic, potentially cutting them off from any lands in that direction. They demanded a renegotiation, leading both parties to meet in the Spanish town of Tordesillas the following year. The resulting treaty moved the line significantly further west, to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This small adjustment, negotiated over maps and globes, would silently dictate the destiny of two continents. The Treaty of Tordesillas was a breathtaking act of arrogance and imagination. With a single stroke of a pen, two European powers and a pope divided the entire globe, allocating entire civilizations and continents they knew nothing about, as if they were merely carving up a pie. The consequences were immediate and profound for the colonial powers. Portugal's sphere east of the line granted it exclusive claim to the entire coast of Africa, the route to India, and, as it would later turn out, a massive protrusion of South America, Brazil. This accidental inclusion of Brazil is why Portuguese is spoken there today, a direct and lasting result of that shifted line. Spain's domain west of the line gave it claim to the overwhelming bulk of the Americas, from California to Patagonia, an empire upon which the sun truly never set. But the treaty's most profound and tragic influence was on the millions of indigenous people living in these newly allotted territories. This silent agreement, made in a European town thousands of miles away, set in motion the forces of conquest, colonization, and cultural destruction that would unfold over the next centuries. It provided the legal and moral fig leaf for the Spanish conquistadors and Portuguese bandeirantes, justifying their campaigns of subjugation as the enforcement of a divinely sanctioned order. The treaty didn't just prevent a war between Spain and Portugal. It effectively declared a war on everyone else, authorizing a relentless expansion that would forever alter the demographics, languages, and cultures of the New World. The fate of the Aztec and Inca empires, of the Tupi and Guarani peoples, was sealed not by a single battle, but by the diplomatic maneuvering in Tordesillas. It stands as the ultimate example of how a silent treaty, conceived to keep the peace between rivals, could unleash waves of unintended consequences, redrawing the map of human civilization through negotiation rather than conquest, and demonstrating that the most far-reaching power shifts often begin not with a declaration of war, but with a quiet agreement in a closed room. North of the border, a different kind of crisis was unfolding, one that threatened to plunge Scotland and England into a war neither kingdom could afford. The year was 1290, and the Scottish throne stood perilously empty. Alexander III, a strong and capable king, had died tragically in a storm after his horse plunged over a cliff, leaving no direct heir. His only living descendant was his young granddaughter, Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway, who was just a child living in her native Norway. This created a dangerous power vacuum, with several powerful Scottish noble families, known as the Competitors, eyeing the crown and threatening to tear the kingdom apart in a bloody civil war. To the south, England's formidable king, Edward I, saw both a threat and an opportunity. A fractured, warring Scotland on his border was a security risk, but it also presented a chance to extend his influence northward through diplomacy rather than conquest. The solution that emerged was a breathtakingly ambitious piece of statecraft, the Treaty of Bergam, negotiated between the Guardians of Scotland, a group of nobles who had stepped in to rule in the absence of a monarch, and King Edward. The treaty proposed a radical vision for peaceful unification. It centered on a dynastic marriage between the young Margaret, the rightful Queen of Scots, and Edward's own son and heir, the future Edward II. On the surface, this seemed like a classic medieval marriage alliance, but the devil and the true genius was in the meticulously negotiated details. The Scottish Guardians, fiercely protective of their nation's identity, insisted on ironclad legal safeguards that were written directly into the treaty. Scotland was to remain a separate and free kingdom in its own right. Its ancient laws, customs, and borders were to be inviolate and forever preserved. No Scottish citizen would be called to answer for a crime in an English court, and no taxes raised in Scotland would be used to fund English wars. The treaty was designed to create a mere personal union, two distinct crowns resting on a single head, not an absorption of one nation by the other. This was a revolutionary concept. The Treaty of Bergam wasn't just about preventing a war. It was a forward-thinking attempt to engineer a peaceful, equitable partnership that respected the sovereignty of the smaller kingdom. It demonstrated a sophisticated understanding that true, lasting union could not be built on force alone, but required consent and legal guarantees to protect the weaker party from being subsumed by the stronger. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed to offer a blueprint for a future where Scotland and England could be allies and partners, bound by marriage and mutual interest rather than rivals and conquerors. The tragic irony, of course, is that this carefully constructed future never came to pass. The young Queen Margaret, the linchpin of the entire agreement, fell ill and died during her sea voyage from Norway to Scotland. Her death shattered the treaty's very foundation, leaving the Scottish succession in chaos and opening the door for Edward I's subsequent, far more aggressive and coercive interventions in Scottish affairs, which would eventually spark the wars of Scottish independence under figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Yet, to dismiss the Treaty of Bergam as a mere historical footnote is to miss its profound significance. Though it failed in its immediate goal, it succeeded in establishing a powerful diplomatic precedent. Its core principles, the idea of a union of crowns rather than a conquest, and the critical importance of legal protections for a smaller nation's autonomy did not die with the Maid of Norway. Over 3 centuries later, when King James VI of Scotland also became James I of England in 1603, creating the Union of the Crowns, the ghost of Bergam was present. The lessons learned from its careful, if ultimately futile, negotiations informed the discussions and anxieties that surrounded that later union. The treaty stands as a poignant testament to the power of what might have been, a road not taken that nonetheless illuminated the path for others, proving that even the most promising diplomatic agreements can be undone by fate, but the ideals they champion can echo through the centuries. Meanwhile, in the sun-drenched landscape of northern Italy, a different kind of rebellion was brewing, one that pitted the collective might of burgeoning cities against the traditional authority of a Holy Roman Emperor. For decades, the ambitious Frederick Barbarossa had sought to impose his will on the wealthy and increasingly independent communes of Lombardy. He saw them as rebellious vassals, subjects who owed him taxes, soldiers, and unquestioning obedience. The cities, however, places like Milan, Cremona, and Brescia saw themselves differently. They were vibrant hubs of commerce and banking, governed by their own elected councils and laws, and they fiercely resisted any attempt to roll back their hard-won liberties. This clash of visions erupted into a series of brutal wars, with Frederick's imperial armies laying siege to defiant cities, and the communes forming a powerful military alliance known as the Lombard League to defend their freedom. The conflict dragged on for years, a costly stalemate that drained the treasuries and spirits of both sides, proving that even the most powerful emperor could not easily subdue a people united by a love of self-rule. The turning point came not on a battlefield, but at the negotiating table in the city of Constance. Exhausted by the endless cycle of violence and recognizing that total victory was impossible for either side, both Frederick and the Lombard League agreed to a revolutionary compromise. The Peace of Constance, formalized in 1183, was a masterpiece of nuanced diplomacy that skillfully balanced symbolic submission with practical independence. On paper, the Italian cities formally recognized Frederick's overlordship as emperor. This was the crucial concession that saved face for the imperial crown and preserved the theoretical unity of the Holy Roman Empire. But in reality, the treaty granted the communes almost everything they had been fighting for. They received the right to self-government, the ability to raise their own armies, the power to administer their own justice, and the authority to collect their own taxes. The emperor's role was reduced to a distant, ceremonial one. He retained a nominal sovereignty, but the actual levers of power remained firmly in the hands of the local citizens. The immediate impact was the silencing of a generation of warfare. The treaty allowed the cities to demobilize their militias and redirect their immense wealth and energy from destruction to construction. But the true, earth-shattering consequence of the Peace of Constance was the political space it created for a new form of human society to flourish, the independent city-state. Freed from the stifling control of a distant feudal monarch, cities like Venice, Florence, and Genoa were unleashed. They became laboratories of republicanism, experimenting with forms of representative government, civic humanism, and secular law that were unthinkable in the traditional feudal order. Their autonomy provided the essential foundation for the economic explosion that would fund the Renaissance. Merchant princes and banking families, operating under stable and predictable local laws, could amass incredible fortunes through long-distance trade, and they would soon pour that wealth into art, architecture, and scholarship. This treaty did more than just end a war. It quietly midwifed the birth of the modern world. By empowering these urban centers, the Peace of Constance inadvertently shifted the center of gravity in Europe away from the rural castle and the feudal manor and toward the dynamic, bustling piazza. It was within these self-governing cities that the values of individual liberty, civic duty, and commercial innovation took root and grew, values that would eventually challenge and transform the entire medieval worldview. The treaty demonstrated that a diplomatic compromise, one that cleverly separated theoretical authority from actual power, could do more than prevent bloodshed. It could unlock a torrent of human creativity and lay the groundwork for a cultural rebirth that would redefine Western civilization. While the Lombard League was securing its liberties in Italy, a similar struggle for autonomy was unfolding in the rugged mountains of Wales, where the ambitious and charismatic Llewellyn ap Gruffudd had managed to unite much of the country under his banner. For years, he had skillfully exploited the internal troubles of England's King Henry III, who was often distracted by rebellious barons and financial crises at home. Through a combination of military raids and shrewd political maneuvering, Llewellyn had expanded his control, styling himself the Prince of Wales and demanding recognition not as a rebellious subject, but as a sovereign ruler in his own right. This presented a monumental problem for Henry. A full-scale invasion of Wales was a notoriously difficult and expensive endeavor, a lesson learned from the bloody campaigns of his predecessors. The terrain was forbidding, the weather treacherous, and the Welsh people fiercely devoted to their independence. Henry, already weakened by his domestic struggles, faced the prospect of a long, draining war that could bankrupt his treasury and embolden his other enemies. He needed a solution that would secure his western flank without committing to a ruinous military campaign. The answer came in the form of the Treaty of Montgomery, sealed in 1267. In a stunning diplomatic reversal, Henry III did not force Llewellyn into submission. Instead, he formally recognized him as the Prince of Wales. This was not an empty title. The treaty explicitly acknowledged Llewellyn's authority over the other Welsh princes, making him the undisputed ruler of a virtually unified Wales. In return, Llewellyn swore fealty to the English crown as his feudal overlord and agreed to a substantial one-time payment of 30,000 marks. On the surface, it appeared to be a classic feudal arrangement, but its implications were revolutionary. For the first and only time in history, an English king had formally recognized the existence of a single, native-ruled Principality of Wales, a state that could govern itself by its own ancient laws and customs. The treaty was a monumental victory for Llewellyn, achieved not on the battlefield of final conquest, but at the negotiating table of pragmatic necessity. The immediate impact within Wales was transformative. Freed from the constant threat of English invasion, Llewellyn's court became a center of Welsh cultural and political life. Bards and poets, the traditional guardians of Welsh history and identity, flourished under his patronage, composing works that celebrated this new era of self-rule. Native legal codes, the laws of Hywel were reaffirmed and administered by Welsh judges. The period saw a reaffirmation of a distinct Welsh identity, a cultural confidence that had been under threat for generations. The treaty had effectively created a protective bubble, a breathing space that allowed a unique Celtic nation to strengthen its institutions and celebrate its heritage, all under the nominal and distant overlordship of an English king who was for the moment content to collect his tribute and enjoy the peace. Of course, this golden age was built on a fragile foundation. The peace depended entirely on the continued weakness of the English crown and the goodwill of both parties. That foundation crumbled with the death of Henry III and the ascension of his far more formidable and ambitious son, Edward I. Edward viewed the Treaty of Montgomery not as a permanent settlement, but as a temporary expedient made by a weakened father. He saw Llewellyn's powerful, independent Wales not as a loyal fiefdom, but as a threat to the security and unity of his entire realm. When Llewellyn, perhaps overestimating the strength of his diplomatic position, refused to pay full homage to the new king, Edward seized upon it as a pretext for war. The treaty was violated, and Edward launched the devastating conquest that would ultimately end Welsh independence for centuries. Yet, the Treaty of Montgomery's failure does not negate its profound significance. For that brief window of time, it demonstrated that even a powerful medieval monarchy could be forced to the negotiating table to recognize the sovereignty of a smaller, determined nation. It set a powerful diplomatic precedent for the recognition of Celtic rights and territories, a precedent that would echo in later centuries in Scotland and Ireland. The treaty proved that agreements could be powerful tools for marginalized regions, creating vital periods of respite and consolidation that, even if temporary, could forge a national identity strong enough to endure long after the swords had been drawn again. It stands as a poignant reminder that in diplomacy, a temporary victory can still leave a permanent mark on a people's story. While the Treaty of Montgomery was defining a fragile peace in the British Isles, a more enduring and strategically vital agreement was being forged between two of the most respected monarchs of the 13th century. In the south, the ambitious and expansionist James I of Aragon, known as the Conqueror for his dramatic capture of Muslim Valencia, found his realm's northern borders frustratingly ambiguous. His predecessors had held feudal claims over vast territories in southern France, including the powerful counties of Languedoc and Provence, lands that were theoretically under his suzerainty but practically under the influence of the French crown. Conversely, the kings of France, having recently crushed the Cathar heresy in the Albigensian Crusade, had their own historical claims to the county of Barcelona and other Catalan lands. This created a dangerous and complex web of overlapping feudal loyalties, a diplomatic minefield where a single misstep by a local lord could easily escalate into a full-scale war between two powerful Christian kingdoms. It was a classic medieval standoff where the ghost of past claims threatened to ignite a very real and costly present conflict. Into this potential tinderbox stepped two rulers renowned not just for their power, but for their prudence, James I of Aragon and Louis IX of France, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. Both men were at the height of their powers, but both were also acutely aware that their greatest ambitions lay elsewhere. For James, the true prize was the Mediterranean, the continued reconquista against the remaining Muslim taifas in Spain, and the expansion of Aragonese influence into the Balearic Islands and beyond. For Louis, recently returned from the disappointment of the Seventh Crusade, the focus was on the internal consolidation of his kingdom, strengthening royal authority, and preparing for a future, more successful crusading effort. A protracted and expensive war over the Pyrenees, with its difficult terrain and fiercely independent local populations, was a distraction neither king could afford. They recognized that the true path to greatness lay not in fighting each other, but in clearing the board of this nagging dispute so they could focus on their larger, more glorious projects. Their meeting at Corbeil in 1258 was therefore a summit of mutual interest, not a negotiation under duress. The treaty they produced was a model of clear-eyed, pragmatic diplomacy. In a stunning act of mutual renunciation, they simply agreed to cancel each other out. James I formally surrendered all feudal claims and rights he and his ancestors had held over the various territories in Languedoc and Provence. In one stroke, he relinquished a web of theoretical rights that had been a source of tension for generations. In return, King Louis IX did the same, irrevocably abandoning any historic French claims to the county of Barcelona and the other Catalan counties that formed the heart of James's realm. This was not an exchange of land, it was an exchange of illusions, a mutual agreement to stop chasing the phantom claims of the past and instead recognize the clear, practical reality of the present. The Pyrenees Mountains were formally recognized as the natural and permanent border between the Kingdom of France and the Crown of Aragon, a border that, in its essential outline, remains to this day. But the Treaty of Corbeil was more than just a border agreement. It was a multi-layered pact designed to build a lasting peace. To cement this new relationship, it was sealed with a dynastic marriage, betrothing James's daughter, Isabella, to Louis's heir, the future Philip III. This union of blood wove the two royal families together, creating a personal stake in maintaining the peace that went beyond the dry language of the treaty itself. Furthermore, the agreement included clauses to protect the rights of the local nobility whose allegiances were being transferred, ensuring a smooth transition and preventing any localized resistance from sparking a new conflict. The brilliance of the treaty lay in its simplicity and its finality. It took a tangled knot of historical grievances and cut it clean through, replacing ambiguity with clarity and suspicion with a framework for cooperation. The long-term strategic benefits for both powers were immense. Freed from the looming threat of a French invasion from the north, the Crown of Aragon was unleashed to pursue its Mediterranean destiny. Just a few years later, James the Conqueror would turn his full attention to his famous campaign to capture the Kingdom of Majorca, a crucial step in building the maritime empire that would eventually dominate the Western Mediterranean. The treaty provided the secure strategic rear he needed to become a true sea power. For France, the agreement solidified its control over the valuable Languedoc region, finally fully integrating this rich territory into the royal domain and allowing Louis to focus on his project of internal reform and legal codification, efforts that would strengthen the French monarchy for centuries to come. The Treaty of Corbeil stands as a powerful testament to the strategic wisdom of knowing what to let go. By voluntarily surrendering outdated and troublesome claims, both kings gained something far more valuable: the freedom and security to pursue their true ambitions, demonstrating that the most successful diplomacy sometimes involves not gaining new territories, but wisely giving up old ghosts to secure a more prosperous future. Far to the north, in a landscape of dense forests, frozen lakes, and vast, untapped resources, a different kind of border was being negotiated, one not between familiar feudal kingdoms, but between two expanding civilizations with profoundly different worldviews. On one side was the mercantile Republic of Novgorod, a principality of the rising Rus powers, whose wealth was built on the fur trade and whose control stretched eastward from its great city. Its leaders, the boyars, saw the northern wilderness as a source of immense wealth, a domain to be controlled for its precious pelts and strategic river routes. On the other side stood the Kingdom of Sweden, a monarchy steadily consolidating its power and looking to expand its influence across the Baltic Sea. Swedish kings and bishops saw the same territory not just as an economic prize, but as a field for religious and political crusade, a land to be brought under the cross and the crown. Their spheres of influence were on a collision course in the region of Karelia, a resource-rich land that is today part of Finland, and for years this overlap had sparked brutal raids, ambushes, and a simmering low-intensity conflict that drained both powers without offering either a decisive victory. Exhausted by this costly stalemate, and recognizing that a full-scale war in such a remote and difficult theater would be a logistical nightmare for both, the two rivals made a radical decision. They would not fight for the land, they would draw a line across it. In 1323, after careful preparation, delegations from Novgorod and Sweden met at the fortress of Nöteborg, a strategic outpost on an island in the Neva River. The treaty they negotiated was a landmark achievement in medieval diplomacy, precisely because it dealt with such a vast and vague frontier. For the first time, a defined border was established between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic worlds in the far north. The line they drew ran from the eastern branch of the Gulf of Finland northward, cutting through the Karelian Isthmus and into the lake systems beyond, roughly following the course of the Vuoksi River. This was not a line on a detailed map as we would understand it today, but a description based on natural landmarks, watersheds, rivers, and portages that would have been familiar to the local hunters, trappers, and fishermen whose lives it would now govern. The immediate effect was a dramatic de-escalation of violence. by replacing a contested zone with an agreed-upon boundary. The Treaty of Nuremberg effectively neutralized the primary cause of conflict. Local militias and royal troops that had been engaged in constant skirmishing could now stand down. More importantly, the clarity provided by the treaty opened the door for something far more productive than war: regulated trade. With a secure and recognized border, merchants from both sides could travel known routes to engage in exchange, bringing Novgorod's furs, wax, and honey to Swedish traders in exchange for salt, cloth, and silver. This commercial interaction, fostered by peace, began to weave a thin but vital thread of economic interdependence between the two powers, making future conflict less desirable and more costly for both sides. The treaty transformed a lawless frontier into a regulated borderland, shifting the relationship from one of pure hostility to one of managed, if still wary, coexistence. The long-term legacy of this quiet agreement is nothing short of foundational. While the border would be adjusted in later centuries through further wars and treaties, the line established at Nuremberg provided the essential starting point, the original template from which all subsequent borders in the region would be negotiated. It represented the first serious attempt to define a political and cultural dividing line between what would become the Russian and Swedish, and later Finnish spheres. This early act of diplomatic cartography silently laid the groundwork for the modern nation-state of Finland, establishing the Western concept of a linear border in a region where control had previously been understood in terms of tribal allegiance and economic influence. The Treaty of Nuremberg stands as a powerful testament to the idea that even in the most remote and seemingly peripheral corners of the world, far from the glittering courts of Europe, the deliberate and thoughtful process of diplomacy could be used to impose order on chaos, to replace the uncertainty of the frontier with the clarity of a border, and to prove that a line drawn peacefully on parchment could be every bit as powerful as a line drawn in the earth by an army. But even as stable borders were being drawn in the frozen north, the heart of Central Europe was simmering with a different kind of tension, one born not of vague frontiers but of a very specific and valuable inheritance. The rich and strategically vital region of Pomerania, with its access to the Baltic Sea, had become the object of a fierce dynastic dispute between two rising powers: the Kingdom of Poland under the ambitious Casimir III, later known as the Great, and the Kingdom of Bohemia, ruled by the powerful John of Luxembourg, a king who also held the title of King of the Romans, placing him at the pinnacle of German royalty. Both monarchs had compelling, if contested, claims to the duchy, claims backed by complex feudal laws, ancient marriages, and the ever-shifting allegiances of local Pomeranian nobles. The stage was set for a brutal war that could easily draw in neighboring German states and the Teutonic Order, threatening to ignite a wider conflagration across the entire region. It was a classic medieval powder keg where the pride of kings and the value of a coastline threatened to spill the blood of thousands. Recognizing the immense danger of this escalating rivalry, a higher authority stepped in to douse the fuse before it could be lit. Pope Benedict XII, acting in his traditional role as the ultimate arbiter of Christian princes, offered his mediation. His intervention was not merely a suggestion. It carried the immense spiritual and political weight of the papacy, an offer that neither king could easily refuse without risking moral condemnation and diplomatic isolation. The two parties, along with their councils of advisors, gathered in the town of Trenčín in 1335, not on a battlefield, but in a negotiated space under the Pope's auspices. The discussions were undoubtedly tense, a delicate ballet of royal egos and hard-nosed realpolitik, with papal legates working tirelessly to find a formula that would satisfy the honor and interests of both sides, all while keeping the peace of Christendom. The resulting Treaty of Trenchen was a masterclass in diplomatic compromise. It required both kings to make painful but necessary concessions for the greater good of stability. King Casimir of Poland, in a move that must have been deeply difficult, formally renounced his claim to the entirety of Pomerania, the prize he had so coveted. This was a significant territorial sacrifice. In return, however, he received something arguably more valuable in the long term: peace and recognition. King John of Bohemia, in turn, agreed to drop his own substantial financial claims against the Polish crown, a massive weight of debt and obligation that was lifted from Casimir's treasury. Furthermore, the treaty subtly reinforced the existing borders between Polish Silesia and the Bohemian lands, providing a clearer and more stable division that would prevent future minor squabbles from escalating. It was a clean, if not perfect, exchange: land for financial absolution and a secured frontier. The immediate and most vital success of the treaty was the aversion of a certain war. Two powerful armies stood down, and the people of Pomerania and the borderlands were spared the ravages of invasion, pillage, and displacement. But the long-term strategic benefits for both kingdoms were even more profound. For Casimir the Great of Poland, the treaty was a geopolitical gift. Freed from the immense financial burden of Bohemian claims and the looming military threat on his western flank, he could now redirect all his energy, resources, and considerable administrative talents inward. The following decades of his reign would become legendary as a golden age of internal development. He focused on codifying laws, reforming the currency, encouraging Jewish immigration to bolster commerce, and founding the University of Krakow, the second oldest in Central Europe. Most importantly, he could turn his attention eastward, peacefully expanding Polish influence into the Ruthenian lands of Halych and Volhynia, an expansion that would define Poland's multicultural identity for centuries. The peace bought at Trenchen provided the essential stability for Poland to consolidate and flourish as a major European power. For Bohemia, the treaty was equally beneficial. While John of Luxembourg did not gain all of Pomerania, he secured his dynasty's influence and removed a troublesome rival claim, strengthening his position within the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire. The settlement allowed Bohemia, then at the height of its medieval power under the Luxembourg dynasty, to continue its own internal consolidation and enjoy the immense wealth flowing from its silver mines. The Treaty of Trenchen stands as a perfect example of how skilled third-party mediation can transform a zero-sum conflict into a positive-sum outcome. The Pope, acting as an impartial external arbiter, provided the face-saving framework and the moral authority that allowed two proud kings to step back from the brink. It demonstrated that a powerful mediator could silently shift the balance of power not by taking sides, but by imposing a rational compromise that served the long-term interests of all parties involved, proving that sometimes the greatest victory is not in what you gain, but in the devastating war you wisely avoid. Now shift the scene to the stormy waters of the Baltic Sea, where a revolutionary new kind of power was emerging, one built not on royal bloodlines or feudal oaths, but on ledgers, shipping manifests, and the collective might of merchant guilds. For decades, the Kingdom of Denmark had been the dominant force in the region, its control over the narrow straits between the North Sea and the Baltic, the infamous sound allowing it to levy heavy tolls on all passing merchant ships. This was more than just a revenue stream. It was a stranglehold on the economic lifeblood of Northern Europe. The Danish king, Valdemar IV, was a formidable ruler who sought to rebuild the Danish Empire, and he saw this control as his rightful prerogative. But he was about to run headlong into an opponent unlike any a medieval monarch had ever faced, not a rival king but a corporation. The Hanseatic League, a sprawling network of over 100 independent trading cities from London to Novgorod, was less a state and more a proto-capitalist superpower. Its members from Lübeck to Hamburg to Danzig were bound by mutual commercial interest, and they would not tolerate any threat to their profits. When Valdemar raised the sound tolls and began to interfere with Hanseatic trade, he wasn't just picking a fight with a few merchants. He was declaring war on the entire economic engine of the Baltic. The conflict that followed, while involving naval blockades and skirmishes, was fundamentally an economic war. The Hanseatic League's weapon of choice was not the broadsword but the trade embargo. They could and did freeze Denmark out of the vast commercial network they controlled, halting the flow of salt, grain, cloth, and silver that the Danish economy and crown depended upon. This was a form of coercion that no feudal army could effectively counter. The war culminated with a stunning Hanseatic naval victory, but the true masterpiece was the peace that followed. The treaty signed in Stralsund in 1370 was not a document of surrender in the traditional sense. It was a corporate takeover agreement. King Valdemar was forced to grant the Hanseatic League concessions that were breathtaking in their scope and permanence. The League received not just a reduction of the sound tolls, but outright control over them for a period of 15 years. They were given the right to veto the election of any new Danish king who did not confirm their privileges. Most astonishingly, they were granted possession of key fortresses that controlled the sea lanes, including those guarding the Sound itself. This meant the merchants now held the literal keys to the kingdom's most valuable economic asset. The immediate effect was the total inversion of the traditional power structure. The Hanseatic League, a non-state entity governed by a diet of merchant representatives, now held more sway over Danish fiscal and trade policy than the Danish nobility itself. The kingdom's sovereignty was, in this crucial economic sphere, effectively leased out to a foreign consortium. For the League, the victory was absolute. Their merchants now operated with unparalleled freedom, their goods moving through the Baltic without hindrance, their competitors squeezed out by their privileged position. The treaty cemented their monopoly over the North Sea and Baltic trade for another century, generating wealth on an almost unimaginable scale that built the magnificent brick Gothic town halls and churches that still define cities like Lübeck and Tallinn today. The long-term implications of the Peace of Stralsund, however, reached far beyond balance sheets and shipping lanes. It signaled a profound shift in the medieval world order. For the first time, a confederation of cities answerable to no single king or emperor had defeated a major monarchy and dictated terms that subordinated royal authority to commercial interest. It was a powerful early example of the rise of non-state actors entities whose power derived from capital and contracts rather than crowns and conquest. The treaty demonstrated that economic power could be successfully leveraged to achieve political ends that were once the exclusive domain of armies, proving that control over trade routes and treasury could be more decisive than control over territory. The Hanseatic League's triumph at Stralsund stands as a monumental landmark in history, a silent treaty that announced the arrival of a new force on the world stage. The power of commerce, organized and ruthless, capable of quietly redrawing the map of influence without a king ever lifting a sword. While the Hanseatic League was demonstrating the power of commercial might in the Baltic, on the far western edge of Europe, a different kind of partnership was being forged, one that would prove to be not merely strategic, but astonishingly permanent. The year was 1386, and the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula were locked in a complex and volatile dance for supremacy. The dominant power was Castile, a massive and ambitious kingdom that seemed poised to absorb its smaller neighbors. For the newly established House of Aves in Portugal, the situation was perilous. Just 2 years prior, John I had secured the Portuguese throne by defeating the Castilians at the legendary Battle of El Jubarota, but he knew this victory was a reprieve, not a guarantee. The threat of a renewed and potentially overwhelming Castilian invasion loomed constantly. He needed a powerful ally, and he needed one quickly. His gaze turned north across the Bay of Biscay to an England that was itself embroiled in the 100 Years' War with France. Both kingdoms, in their own way, were facing a common giant. Both needed friends in high places. The instrument of this alliance was not a simple parchment of mutual defense. It was a royal wedding. The Treaty of Windsor was, at its heart, a marriage contract, uniting King John I of Portugal with Philippa of Lancaster, the daughter of England's most powerful figure, John of Gaunt. This was a masterstroke of symbolic diplomacy. By marrying into the Plantagenet dynasty, John I wasn't just gaining a military partner, he was elevating the prestige of his fledgling royal house, weaving it into the very fabric of European aristocracy. The treaty itself was remarkably comprehensive, a testament to its architect's foresight. It created a perpetual, inviolable, and true league of friendship between the two crowns. It bound each kingdom to come to the other's aid militarily if attacked, a crucial guarantee for Portugal against Castile and for England against the possibility of a Castilian-French pincer movement. But it went far beyond mere soldiers and swords. The treaty also granted extensive trading privileges to merchants from both nations, laying the groundwork for an economic partnership that would fuel both kingdoms for generations. The immediate impact was a powerful deterrent. The knowledge that an attack on Portugal would now mean war with England, a battle-hardened kingdom with a formidable navy and a long history of campaigning on the continent, gave the rulers of Castile serious pause. It effectively froze the status quo on the Iberian Peninsula, securing Portugal's hard-won independence and allowing John I to focus on the internal consolidation of his kingdom rather than perpetual defense of its borders. For England, it secured a valuable foothold on the continent, a friendly port for its navy, and a strategic ally that could threaten Castile's southern flank, complicating any plans Castile might have to aid France. Yet the true, world-altering magic of the Treaty of Windsor lay not in the battles it prevented, but in the future it silently built. The union of John and Philippa was not just politically astute, it was personally fruitful. Their children, known to history as the illustrious generation, would become the driving force behind Portugal's epic age of discoveries. Their son, Prince Henry the Navigator, imbued with his mother's English connections and perhaps a blend of both kingdoms' adventurous spirits, would famously sponsor the voyages that began the systematic exploration of the Atlantic and the West African coast. This familial link provided Portugal with access to English maritime technology, map-making knowledge, and even financing, elements that were critical in launching its exploratory endeavors. The treaty created a transnational network of support and exchange that made these voyages possible. Centuries later, this same alliance would provide a crucial lifeline for England. During the Napoleonic Wars, when much of Europe was under French control, the British Army used Portugal as a secure base for the Peninsular Campaign, a steadfast ally that never wavered. This unwavering mutual support, stretching from the Age of Knights to the Age of Industry, earned the Treaty of Windsor a unique title, the oldest active diplomatic alliance in the world. It is a bond that has endured for over 600 years, surviving revolutions, regime changes, and world wars. Its power was never in a single dramatic enforcement, but in the quiet, constant presence of a promise kept, a reminder that the most resilient structures of power are often built not on the shifting sands of temporary advantage, but on the bedrock of enduring trust, mutual interest, and the subtle, lasting ties of family and friendship. Now imagine the heart of Europe torn apart not by a fight over land or a crown, but by a question of faith, a debate over how to properly take communion. This was the explosive core of the Hussite Wars in Bohemia, a conflict that raged for nearly 2 decades and turned the Czech lands into a bloody battleground of ideas. It began with the fiery teachings of Jan Hus, a reformer who, like England's Wycliffe, argued for a church rooted in scripture and accessible to the people, a message that resonated deeply with nobles and commoners alike. His execution for heresy in 1415 didn't silence his ideas, it ignited them, transforming his martyrdom into a rallying cry for a national and religious uprising. The Hussites, as his followers became known, were not a monolithic group, but they were united by a few core demands, the most powerful and symbolic being the right for all believers, not just the clergy, to receive communion in both kinds, both the bread and the wine. This practice, known as Utraquism, was a direct challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church, a defiant assertion that the laity deserved a full share in the central sacrament of the faith. For years, the response from Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor was not negotiation, but crusade. 5 separate papal crusades were launched against the Hussites, each one intending to crush this heresy with overwhelming military force. But a stunning thing happened. Led by brilliant generals like Jan Žižka, the Hussite forces, a mix of peasant farmers, disciplined infantry, and radical preachers, used innovative tactics and unshakable morale to defeat the imperial armies sent against them again and again. They defended their homeland with a ferocity born of conviction, turning their wagons into mobile fortresses and their faith into an invincible shield. Yet, despite these victories, a total military solution remained elusive for both sides. The Hussites, though brilliant defenders, struggled to project their power far beyond Bohemia's borders, and the Catholic forces, despite their vast resources, could not break the spirit of the Czech people. The war settled into a grueling, bloody stalemate that exhausted everyone involved, from the emperors and popes to the farmers whose fields were perpetually soaked in blood. It became clear that this was a conflict that could not be won by the sword alone. It had to be settled with words. This recognition led to a series of councils, the most significant being the Council of Basel, where church fathers finally agreed to sit down with the Hussite representatives and talk. These were not negotiations between equals in the modern sense. The church still held immense power, but the very act of talking to those they had previously labeled heretics was a monumental shift in strategy, an admission that doctrine might have to bend to achieve peace. The resulting agreement, the Compactate of Prague, formalized in 1436, was a masterpiece of theological finesse and pragmatic compromise. It did not declare the Hussites the winners, nor did it force them into total surrender. Instead, it created a carefully worded, official exception to universal church practice. The church granted the Utraquists their central demand, the right to offer communion under both kinds to all willing laypeople within the lands of the Bohemian crown. In return, the Hussite factions agreed to reaffirm their overall loyalty to the Catholic Church and its hierarchy, effectively ending their rebellion and reintegrating Bohemia back into the spiritual fold of Christendom. The immediate impact was the silencing of the guns. After nearly 20 years of relentless warfare, peace finally descended upon Bohemia. The Crusades ceased, the armies disbanded, and a generation that had known little but conflict could begin the long, painful process of rebuilding their shattered society. But the true revolutionary power of the Compactate lay in its deeper implications. For the first time in the history of medieval Europe, the Catholic Church had officially and formally acknowledged a dissenting religious practice, incorporating it into its own structure. This was not a victory parade for one side, but a genuine, albeit limited, pluralism enforced by a treaty. It silently altered the very nature of ecclesiastical power, demonstrating that the Church's authority could, under immense pressure, be negotiated with. It established a precedent that religious unity did not have to mean absolute uniformity, a radical idea that would echo through the following centuries and inspire later reformers during the Protestant Reformation. The legacy of this quiet agreement is a complex one. While the peace it brought was fragile and the Compactate itself would later be repudiated by a more intolerant papacy, its spirit proved indestructible. It had shown that even the most bitterly contested ideological battles, those fought over the salvation of souls, could be resolved through dialogue and a mutual desire to end suffering. It planted an early seed for the principle of religious tolerance, demonstrating that coexistence, however imperfect, was preferable to endless holy war. The Compactate of Prague stands as a profound testament to the power of diplomacy in the face of absolutism, a silent treaty that proved even the gates of heaven could be negotiated. Yet even as the Compactate of Prague was bringing a fragile peace to Bohemia, the longest and most devastating conflict of the Middle Ages, the 100 Years' War between England and France, was reaching a critical turning point, and it would be decided not on the battlefield but in a council chamber in Arras. For decades, the English war effort had relied on a devastatingly effective strategy: divide and conquer. Their most powerful weapon wasn't the longbow, though that was fearsome enough, but their alliance with the Duchy of Burgundy, a sprawling, wealthy, and semi-independent territory that was technically part of France but in practice a rival kingdom in all but name. Under the ambitious Duke Philip the Good, Burgundy had become the engine of English success. His armies fought alongside theirs, his ports supplied their troops, and his territories provided a secure base of operations deep inside France. This Franco-Burgundian civil war within the larger war had brought France to its knees, leaving the legitimate king, Charles VII, mocked as the King of Burges for the pitifully small area he actually controlled. He was a monarch in name only, presiding over a fractured and demoralized nation. The Congress of Arras, convened in 1435, was meant to be a grand peace conference involving all parties: England, France, and Burgundy, with mediators from the Pope and the Council of Basel. But from the outset, the English delegation, arrogant and overconfident, made a fatal miscalculation. They believed their military successes and their tight alliance with Burgundy were unshakable. They presented their terms not as offers for negotiation, but as demands for surrender, insisting that Charles VII give up his claim to the French crown and accept Henry VI of England as the true King of France. This was an impossible, insulting ultimatum, and it immediately deadlocked the talks with the French, but it also created a crucial opening. The English, in their hubris, had fundamentally misread their most important ally. They assumed Duke Philip's loyalty was guaranteed, failing to see the growing cracks in the partnership. For Philip the Good, the alliance with England was always a marriage of convenience, not of love. He had originally sided with the English to avenge the murder of his father by associates of the French crown, a deep personal wound, but years of war had changed the calculus. The English were proving to be difficult and overbearing partners, often prioritizing their own goals over Burgundian interests. Furthermore, the rising tide of French nationalism, stirred by the legend of Joan of Arc even after her execution, was making the Burgundian position increasingly uncomfortable. They were seen as traitors to their own people. Most importantly, Philip was a pragmatic ruler. He began to see that a strong, unified France under a king who owed him a colossal debt of gratitude could be far more beneficial to Burgundy's long-term ambitions than a perpetually weakened France partitioned under English rule. The Congress of Arras presented him with the perfect stage to execute a breathtaking diplomatic pivot. The treaty that emerged was a masterwork of realpolitik. In a stunning reversal, Philip the Good formally renounced his alliance with England and reconciled with Charles VII. The price for his loyalty was high, but Charles, advised by his brilliant financier Jacques Coeur, wisely agreed to pay it. Philip was granted full exemption from homage to the French crown for his lifetime, a symbolic recognition of his virtual independence. He received significant territorial concessions, including the strategically vital Somme towns and the counties of Mâcon and Auxerre. Most crucially, he was promised that the men responsible for his father's death would be punished. In return, Philip abandoned the English cause and recognized Charles as the undisputed king of France. The English delegation, realizing they had been completely outmaneuvered, walked out of the Congress in a fury, but the damage was done. Their most powerful ally had just become their most dangerous enemy. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for England. Overnight, their strategic position in France collapsed. The Burgundian ports that had been their lifeline were closed to them. The Burgundian armies that had fought beside them now turned against them. The heartland of France, once a safe operating zone, became hostile territory. This single diplomatic agreement did what decades of French military effort had failed to do. It isolated England completely. Charles VII, now free from the threat of a Burgundian stab in the back, could finally focus his resources on the real enemy. The following years would see a relentless and successful French reconquest. Fueled by the reformed finances and professional army Charles was now able to build. The Treaty of Arras didn't just shift the momentum of the 100 Years' War, it effectively decided its outcome. It proved that in the complex chessboard of medieval politics, a well-timed and well-paid betrayal could achieve more than any army, demonstrating that the most decisive blows are sometimes struck not with a sword, but with a signature on a piece of parchment, forever altering the destiny of nations through the silent art of the deal. While the Treaty of Arras was dramatically reshaping the fortunes of Western Europe, a much earlier but equally pragmatic agreement along the contested frontier between Germany and Poland demonstrated that the same principles of calculated compromise could bring stability to the heart of the continent. The early 11th century was a time of fragile state building for both the Holy Roman Empire under Henry II and the nascent Polish realm under its first crowned king, Boleslaw I, known as the Brave. Both rulers faced a similar challenge: how to project royal authority over a sprawling and often unruly collection of duchies and tribes, all while guarding against external threats. For Henry, those threats came from rebellious Saxon nobles and the ever-present pressure from the French in the west. For Boleslaw, it was the constant menace of pagan Prussian raids on his northern borders and the ambition of the Kievan Rus to his east. Yet, instead of focusing on these external dangers, the two Christian monarchs found themselves locked in a costly and distracting series of wars over the fertile borderlands of Lusatia and Meerssen, a region of strategic river crossings and wealthy towns that each king claimed as his own. These conflicts were a drain on both treasuries and military resources, a classic case of two powerful entities weakening each other to the potential benefit of their other common enemies. The Treaty of Bautzen, concluded in 1018, was a masterclass in pragmatic statecraft from both leaders. After years of inconclusive campaigning, neither had achieved a decisive victory, and both recognized the diminishing returns of continued conflict. The agreement they forged was not a total victory for one side, but a balanced exchange of concessions that addressed the core interests of both parties. King Boleslaw achieved a significant territorial gain, with the Emperor Henry formally recognizing Polish sovereignty over the entire region of Lusatia. This was a substantial prize, a wealthy territory that extended Poland's western frontier and provided a valuable buffer zone against future German incursions. In return, Boleslaw made a crucial symbolic concession. He formally recognized Henry's overlordship, performing an act of homage for the lands he held, which included not only the newly acquired Lusatia, but also his own ancestral domains in Poland. On the surface, this appeared to subordinate the Polish king to the German emperor, but in practice, it was a brilliant piece of political theater. The homage was largely nominal. Boleslaw retained complete autonomy over his internal affairs, his army, and his right to make foreign policy. He gave up a measure of theoretical prestige to gain a very real and valuable territory, while Henry could return to Germany and proclaim a diplomatic victory, having seemingly brought the powerful Polish ruler into the imperial fold as a loyal vassal. The true genius of the treaty lay in the breathing space it created for both monarchs. For Boleslaw, securing his western border through a diplomatic agreement rather than a permanent military garrison freed up his formidable army to pursue expansion elsewhere. Almost immediately, he was able to turn his attention eastward, launching a successful campaign into the Kievan Rus and even capturing the city of Kiev, temporarily placing his son-in-law on the throne and dramatically expanding Polish influence. For Henry II, the peace on his eastern front was equally valuable. It allowed him to focus his energies on consolidating his power within Germany itself, particularly in pacifying the rebellious Duchy of Bavaria and managing the complex politics of the Italian peninsula, where his imperial title required constant attention. The treaty transformed a volatile and draining border conflict into a stable, if not always warm, peaceful coexistence. It demonstrated that a border need not be a fixed line of hostility, but could be a negotiated space, a consciously created buffer that served the strategic interests of both sides. The Treaty of Bautzen did not create an everlasting peace between Pole and German, but it established a powerful precedent. It proved that even between emerging national identities, conflict could be managed and contained through diplomacy, that territorial concessions could be a tool for building a more stable future, and that sometimes the most effective way to strengthen your kingdom was to know when to stop fighting and start talking. Now let us set sail from the contentious borders of Europe to the open sea, where a different kind of order was being imposed not by kings and emperors, but by the practical necessities of wind, wave, and commerce. In an age without radios, GPS, or standardized maps, the medieval maritime world was a realm of immense danger and staggering lawlessness. Disputes between ship captains and their crews, between merchants and shipowners, or between competing vessels from different ports could easily escalate into violence, piracy, or simply the catastrophic loss of valuable cargoes and lives. The sea was a frontier without a sheriff, where a captain's word was the only law, and that law changed with every flag flown from the mast. This chaotic environment was a major brake on the economic potential of Europe, who would invest vast sums in a trading voyage if the rules of the journey were uncertain, and there was no court to appeal to beyond the horizon. Into this void of authority stepped one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. As the former Queen of France, current Queen of England, and Duchess of her own vast and wealthy territories in southwestern France, Eleanor possessed a unique cross-channel perspective and a direct interest in the prosperity of the ports within her domains like Bordeaux and La Rochelle. While not a lawmaker in the modern sense, she acted as a brilliant facilitator and patron, convening and endorsing a gathering of the wisest and most experienced minds of the sea, veteran shipmasters, seasoned merchants, and savvy harbor judges on the Isle of Oleron, a strategic hub in the Bay of Biscay. Their mission was audacious: to codify the unwritten customs of the sea into a clear, written, and universally respected legal code. The resulting laws of Oleron were a masterpiece of practical medieval jurisprudence. They addressed the myriad problems of maritime life with stunning clarity and fairness. The codes meticulously detailed the responsibilities and shares of profit for every member of a ship's crew, from the captain down to the lowliest deckhand, preventing disputes over wages that could cripple a voyage. They established clear procedures for handling emergencies, such as the famous jettison rule, which dictated that if cargo had to be thrown overboard to save a ship in a storm, the cost of the lost goods would be shared proportionally by all the merchants whose cargo was saved, an early form of maritime insurance that spread risk and encouraged investment. The laws even prescribed punishments for a drunken captain whose negligence endangered the ship, and they laid out the process for resolving collisions between vessels, moving judgment from the realm of immediate retaliation to cool-headed arbitration. The impact of this legal innovation was profound and immediate. By providing a predictable and fair set of rules, the laws of Oleron drastically reduced the friction and fear that had plagued sea trade. Merchants from different regions could now enter contracts with confidence, knowing that a recognized legal framework existed to enforce them. Ship captains from Bordeaux to Bruges could operate under a common understanding of right and wrong at sea, reducing misunderstandings that could lead to violence. This legal standardization acted as a powerful lubricant for commerce, silently enabling a massive expansion of trade across the Bay of Biscay, the English Channel, and eventually throughout the North Sea. The ports under Elena's influence, particularly Bordeaux and La Rochelle, flourished as beacons of this new legal security, their wealth growing exponentially as safe and reliable hubs in an increasingly connected maritime network. Perhaps the greatest testament to the power of this silent treaty is its astonishing legacy. The laws of Oleron did not remain a local curiosity. They became the foundational text for nearly all subsequent Western maritime law. They were adopted and adapted by the powerful Hanseatic League, becoming the basis of their own sea codes. They crossed the Channel to form the core of English Admiralty law, and from there they traveled across the Atlantic with British colonists to influence the maritime traditions of the New World. In a very real sense, the modern international laws that govern shipping and trade today can trace their lineage back to that 12th century gathering. This demonstrates a profound truth, that the most enduring power structures are not always those imposed by conquest, but those built on a foundation of agreed-upon rules and mutual benefit. Elena and her panel of experts achieved what no army could. They tamed the chaos of the sea not with warships, but with wisdom, creating a framework of order that would silently guide commerce and foster connection for centuries to come. While the laws of Oleron were bringing order to the high seas, back on the sun-baked plains of the Pyrenees, the complex dance of dynastic diplomacy was once again being used to settle a stubborn territorial dispute that threatened to erupt into open war. The conflict centered on the county of Roussillon and the lordship of Montpellier, valuable territories that sat uneasily on the frontier between the expanding crown of Aragon and the powerful Kingdom of France. For generations, the kings of Aragon had held feudal claims to Montpellier, a prosperous trading city, while the French crown viewed the Aragonese presence in Roussillon with deep suspicion, seeing it as a threat to their southern flank. This created a tense and volatile standoff, a diplomatic powder keg where the ambitions of two proud royal houses overlapped, each backed by legal precedent and a readiness to defend their rights with force. It was precisely the kind of costly, distracting conflict that wise rulers sought to avoid. The resolution arrived in 1284 with the Treaty of Narbonne, a masterful agreement that turned potential enemies into partners through the sophisticated tools of territorial exchange and dynastic marriage. The architect on the Aragonese side was the formidable King Peter III, a ruler with grand ambitions not in the hills of southern France, but across the Mediterranean Sea. He recognized that a war with France would be a catastrophic diversion from his true goal, the conquest of the island of Sicily, which he claimed through his marriage to its heiress. To secure his northern border and free his hands for this Mediterranean venture, Peter made a bold and pragmatic offer. He agreed to formally renounce all of his ancient feudal claims to the city of Montpellier and the surrounding territory, effectively ceding it to the French crown. This was a significant concession, the surrender of a long-held ambition. In return, the French king, Philip III, recognized Aragonese sovereignty over Roussillon and the neighboring Cerdagne, solidifying Peter's control over these crucial Pyrenean territories. But the treaty's genius lay in its second layer. To ensure this new peace was not just a temporary truce but a lasting settlement, it was sealed with a dynastic union. Peter III's son and heir, the future King Alfonso III, was betrothed to Philip III's daughter, Blanche of Anjou. This marriage wove the two royal families together, creating a blood bond that made the peace a matter of family honor and mutual interest, not just a piece of parchment. It transformed the relationship from one of rivals to one of in-laws, providing a powerful personal incentive for both courts to maintain the agreement and manage any future disputes through dialogue rather than mobilization. The Treaty of Narbonne was a classic win-win, a silent recalibration of power where both sides gave up something they wanted less to secure something they wanted more. The immediate success of the treaty was the complete de-escalation of tensions along the Franco-Aragonese border. Armies that might have been clashing in the foothills of the Pyrenees were instead available for other ventures. For France, it meant the peaceful absorption of Montpellier, a wealthy addition to the royal domain that strengthened their presence in the south without a drop of blood spilled. For Aragon, the benefits were truly transformative. With his northern frontier secured by both treaty and family ties, Peter III could launch his long-planned campaign for Sicily with full force. His subsequent victory established the crown of Aragon as a major Mediterranean power, a maritime empire that would eventually encompass not only Sicily but also Naples, Sardinia, and even parts of Greece. The Treaty of Narbonne provided the essential strategic security that made this explosive expansion possible. It demonstrated with brilliant clarity that a kingdom's greatest advances could be made not by fighting for every inch of land on its immediate border, but by wisely trading a minor claim for the freedom to pursue a grander destiny elsewhere, a lesson in strategic prioritization that would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come. Now, let us cross the Channel to witness a treaty that sought to end one of the most enduring and bitter rivalries in all of medieval history, a feud that had defined the political landscape of Western Europe for generations. The conflict between the royal houses of Capet in France and Plantagenet in England was not a simple border dispute. It was a tangled, dynastic imbroglio of epic proportions. The King of England, by virtue of his ancestors' marriages and conquests, was also the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, and the Duke of Aquitaine, making him the most powerful and land-rich vassal of the French crown. In practice, however, these English monarchs often acted more like independent sovereigns than dutiful subjects, creating an impossible situation where the theoretical overlord in Paris was often weaker than his own supposedly subordinate vassal across the water. This untenable arrangement had fueled decades of warfare, a costly and exhausting struggle that had drained the treasuries and spirits of both kingdoms without delivering a decisive victory for either side. The man who finally broke this dangerous stalemate was a ruler known less for his martial prowess and more for his profound piety and political wisdom, Louis IX of France, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. After a series of military setbacks, including his capture and ransom during the disastrous Seventh Crusade, Louis returned to his kingdom with a renewed commitment to peace and justice. He recognized that the endless war with England was a spiritual and economic blight on both nations. On the other side of the conflict, England's King Henry III was in an equally precarious position. His reign had been marked by internal strife, including a major rebellion by his own barons who were furious over the cost and failure of his foreign wars and his perceived mismanagement of the kingdom. Henry was in desperate need of a respite from external conflict so he could address the mounting crises within England itself. Both kings, for their own reasons, were finally ready to talk. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1259, was a monumental act of diplomatic realism that required both monarchs to make painful but necessary concessions. In a move that must have been excruciating for his pride and his dynastic legacy, Henry III made the greatest concession. He formally and irrevocably surrendered his ancient family claims to the lost territories of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Poitou. These were the very heartlands of the old Angevin Empire, the continental possessions that had made his father, King John, such a powerful figure. In return for this massive renunciation, Louis IX did not simply let him walk away empty-handed. He confirmed Henry's right to hold the Duchy of Gascony in southwestern France, but with a crucial and humbling condition. Henry would hold it as a full vassal of the French crown, performing liege homage directly to Louis. This meant that for this valuable territory, the King of England was now legally and publicly subordinate to the King of France. The immediate impact was a desperately needed peace. The relentless warfare along the frontiers ceased, allowing both kingdoms to breathe and rebuild. For Henry, this peace provided the political space he needed to confront his domestic opponents and begin the long process of stabilizing his rule, though it would ultimately lead to the Second Barons' War and the rise of Simon de Montfort. For Louis, the treaty was a masterstroke. He had achieved through diplomacy what his predecessors had failed to win through decades of combat: the formal recognition of French sovereignty over vast stretches of territory and the explicit subordination of the English crown in its remaining French holdings. The Treaty of Paris didn't just end a war, it silently but decisively shifted the balance of power in France's favor, consolidating the Capetian monarchy's authority and setting the stage for the expansion of the royal domain. Yet the treaty's most profound legacy was an unintended and deeply ironic one. By forcing the King of England into a position of explicit vassalage for Gascony, the agreement created a permanent source of tension and a perfect pretext for future conflict. For the next century, every time a new king ascended either the English or French throne, the issue of performing homage for Gascony would arise. The English kings, fiercely proud and independent, deeply resented this ceremonial act of subordination. The French kings, insisting on their feudal rights, could use any English hesitation or refusal as a legal justification to summon them to court, levy fines, or even, as they eventually did, declare the duchy forfeit. The Treaty of Paris, designed to create a lasting peace, actually planted the seeds for an even greater and more devastating war. It established the very legal framework and grievance that, generations later, would be used to justify the opening of the 100 Years' War. proving that even the most well-intentioned diplomatic settlements can contain within them the hidden blueprints for future conflict, a stark reminder that the pursuit of peace is often as complex and unpredictable as war itself. After years of bitter conflict that had drained the treasuries and manpower of both sides, King Casimir III of Poland and the leadership of the Teutonic Order found themselves locked in a costly stalemate. The heart of their dispute was the rich and strategically vital region of Pomerelia, often called Eastern Pomerania, which controlled access to the Baltic Sea. The Teutonic Knights, a powerful military order originally invited to Poland to fight pagan tribes, had seized the territory decades earlier during a period of Polish weakness, and they had since fortified it heavily and integrated it into their crusader state. For Casimir, regaining this coastline was not merely a matter of national pride. It was an economic and strategic imperative for the Kingdom of Poland, cutting off its access to maritime trade and leaving it landlocked. Yet, dislodging the heavily fortified knights by force would have required a massive, protracted war that Poland could ill afford, especially with other threats looming on its eastern and southern borders. Similarly, the Teutonic Order, though militarily formidable, was facing growing diplomatic pressure from the Pope and neighboring powers, who were becoming increasingly skeptical of the Order's constant expansionist wars against fellow Christians. Both sides needed a way out that would save face and secure their most vital interests without further bloodshed. The Treaty of Calais, signed in 1343, provided this elegant escape through a brilliant, face-saving compromise. In a stunning reversal of decades of Teutonic control, the Order agreed to return the entirety of Pomerelia to the Polish crown. This was a monumental victory for Casimir, achieving his primary territorial objective without having to launch a risky invasion. However, this restoration came with a significant financial price tag. In exchange for the land, Casimir agreed to pay the Teutonic Order a substantial indemnity of 10,000 silver marks. On the surface, this might have looked like Poland was buying back its own territory, a potential point of humiliation. But in the nuanced language of medieval diplomacy, this payment was carefully framed not as a purchase price, but as a reimbursement for the Order's alleged costs of administration and improvements made to the region during their rule. This legal fiction was the treaty's masterstroke. It allowed the Teutonic Knights to retreat from Pomerelia without admitting they had stolen it unjustly in the first place. They could present the settlement to their own supporters as a prudent financial transaction rather than a military defeat. For Casimir, the monetary cost was a pragmatic investment, far cheaper than the ruinous expense of a continued war, and it secured the return of the land with full sovereignty. The immediate effect was the transformation of Poland's geopolitical standing. With the peaceful return of Pomerelia, Poland was no longer a landlocked kingdom vulnerable to economic strangulation. It now possessed a precious strip of Baltic coastline, which included the growing port city of Gdansk. This access to the sea opened up new avenues for trade, allowing Polish grain, timber, and other goods to flow directly into the lucrative Hanseatic trade networks, which would later become the foundation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's immense wealth. Just as importantly, the treaty secured Poland's western flank for generations. The lengthy and often violent conflict with the Teutonic Order was effectively concluded, freeing up Casimir's army, his treasury, and his political capital for other pressing matters. This newfound security provided the essential stability for Casimir's most enduring legacy, his profound internal reforms. History would know him as Casimir the Great for a reason, and the peace bought at Calais made it all possible. With the western border secure, he could focus on a breathtaking project of national development. He reformed the legal system, creating a unified code of laws that replaced a patchwork of local customs. He encouraged Jewish immigration, granting protections that made Poland a haven from persecution and bolstering its commercial class. He founded the University of Krakow, the second oldest in Central Europe, ensuring the kingdom would never want for educated lawyers, doctors, and administrators. Most significantly, he could turn his attention eastward. Freed from the Teutonic threat, Casimir peacefully expanded Polish influence into the Ruthenian lands of Halych and Volhynia, not primarily through conquest, but through shrewd diplomacy and dynastic inheritance. This eastern expansion would define Poland's multicultural identity for centuries to come, and it was all made possible by the diplomatic resolution in the West. The Treaty of Calais, through its clever blend of territorial concession and financial compensation, didn't just end a war, it silently unlocked a golden age of internal consolidation and external expansion, proving that a kingdom's greatest growth can often follow a wisely negotiated peace. While the Treaty of Calais was stabilizing Poland's borders and the great powers were fighting over crowns in the bustling, cloth-rich cities of the Low Countries, a very different kind of conflict was causing just as much anxiety, though it was fought with account books and bales of wool rather than swords and lances. The County of Flanders and the Duchy of Brabant were two of the wealthiest and most urbanized regions in all of Europe, their prosperity built almost entirely on the incredibly lucrative textile trade. Flemish cities like Ghent and Bruges were world-famous for turning raw English wool into fine cloth that was coveted from Moscow to Constantinople, while Brabant's great hub, Antwerp, was emerging as a vital commercial fair town and distribution center. Their economies were deeply interdependent, yet this very connection bred fierce competition and bitter disputes. They clashed over trade routes, imposed punishing tariffs on each other's goods, and supported rival guilds and merchants in a constant, low-grade economic war that threatened to strangle the very commerce that made them rich. A full-blown military conflict between them would have been catastrophic, destroying the workshops and trade networks that were the source of their power. They needed a solution that would protect their profits, not their pride. The answer emerged not from a royal decree, but from a panel of cool-headed arbiters in 1371. The cities themselves, recognizing that their squabbling was mutually destructive, took the lead in pushing for a negotiated settlement at Nymphaeum. This was not a peace treaty imposed after a battle, but a business agreement brokered between commercial partners who had temporarily lost their way. The Treaty of Nymphaeum was a detailed commercial pact, meticulously addressing the specific grievances that had been choking trade. It dramatically reduced or outright eliminated the arbitrary tolls and tariffs that each side had been using to gain an advantage, creating a much freer flow of goods across their shared border. It established clear and fair rules for merchants from both regions, guaranteeing their safety and rights regardless of which city they were operating in. Perhaps most importantly, it created a framework for ongoing arbitration, a mechanism to resolve future disputes through dialogue and legal judgment rather than retaliatory taxes or blockades. The impact of this pragmatic agreement was immediate and transformative for the local economy. With the artificial barriers to trade removed, merchants could now operate with a new sense of security and predictability. The cost of moving goods plummeted, making Flemish cloth and Brabantine finished products more competitive in international markets. The increased commercial activity generated more wealth for the guilds, more tax revenue for the counts and dukes, and more work for the thousands of weavers, dyers, and fullers who were the backbone of the urban economy. The cities of the Low Countries didn't just recover, they entered a new golden age of prosperity, their markets buzzing with activity, their harbors filled with ships from across the continent. This economic boom, silently fueled by the treaty, began to weave the economies of Flanders and Brabant so tightly together that they started to function as a single, integrated economic zone, a proto-common market that was far richer and more resilient than the sum of its parts. This deep economic integration, fostered by agreements like the one at Nijmegen, created a powerful new reality in the heart of Europe, a densely networked, incredibly wealthy urban corridor that was immensely attractive to any ambitious ruler. It was this very unity and prosperity that would soon catch the eye of the Dukes of Burgundy. In the following century, the Burgundians, through a combination of strategic marriages, inheritances, and purchases, would systematically piece together the territories that made up the Low Countries. They were able to do so in part because these regions, thanks to treaties like Nijmegen, were already accustomed to cooperating with one another economically. The Burgundian dukes didn't have to force integration upon a collection of warring states. They were able to step into a pre-existing framework of commercial cooperation and simply place their ducal crown on top of it. The Treaty of Nijmegen, therefore, didn't just boost trade. It silently prepared the ground for the eventual political unification of the Netherlands under first the Burgundians and later the Habsburgs, demonstrating that economic diplomacy could create the conditions for future political unions that would reshape the map of Europe. Imagine two heavyweight champions, exhausted from years of pounding each other in the ring, each knowing that one more round could mean not victory, but collapse for them both. This was the precise situation facing Venice and Genoa by the late 1370s. For over a century, these two maritime republics had been locked in a brutal, on-again, off-again struggle for total mastery of the Mediterranean, a conflict that historians would later call the War of Chioggia. It was a war fought not with vast armies on land, but with fleets of sleek galleys and roundships, a contest over the incredibly lucrative trade routes that brought the silks and spices of the East into the markets of Europe. The financial and human cost of this endless rivalry was staggering, draining the treasuries and manpower of both city-states. The conflict reached its dramatic climax when a Genoese fleet, in a stunning maneuver, actually managed to capture the Venetian lagoon town of Chioggia, putting them within striking distance of Venice itself. It seemed like the final, decisive blow was about to be struck, but in a breathtaking reversal, the Venetians, under the legendary commander Vetta Pisoni, rallied and blockaded the Genoese fleet inside the lagoon, trapping their own attackers. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted, and both sides now found themselves in a desperate siege, locked in a deadly embrace that threatened to annihilate them both. They had fought to a state of mutually assured economic ruin. It was at this moment of perfect, exhausted stalemate that diplomacy found its opening. Neither side could deliver a knockout punch without risking its own destruction. They had to find a way to step back from the brink, to declare a draw that would allow both commercial giants to live and fight another day. The stage was set for a negotiated peace, not in a grand palace, but in the Italian city of Turin, under the mediation of Amadeus VI, the Count of Savoy. The Treaty of Turin, signed in 1381, was a masterpiece of pragmatic balance. It did not attempt to crown a single victor or impose a humiliating peace. Instead, its genius lay in what it didn't do. It carefully avoided dismantling the Genoese Republic or stripping it of its fundamental ability to trade. Genoa was forced to surrender most of its territorial conquests, particularly in the Adriatic Sea, which was formally recognized as a Venetian sphere of influence. This was a significant concession. However, the treaty also placed crucial limits on Venetian expansion, preventing them from using their momentary advantage to completely strangle their rival. It re-established a delicate, if tense, equilibrium. Most importantly, it secured the release of prisoners and the return of captured ships, allowing both merchant fleets to return to the vital business of making money. The immediate impact was a collective sigh of relief across the Mediterranean. The immediate, existential threat was over, but the long-term consequences were even more profound. The treaty allowed both republics to step off their war footing and begin the slow, difficult process of economic recovery. For Venice, this period of hard-won peace was the essential precondition for its golden age. With its maritime supremacy in the Adriatic confirmed and its rivalry with Genoa shifted from all-out war to intense commercial competition, La Serenissima could now pour its resources into what it did best: trade, diplomacy, and building a stable overseas empire. The wealth that began to flow back into the city would, within a generation, fund the stunning architectural and artistic projects that defined the Venetian Renaissance, transforming the city into the mesmerizing marvel we know today. For Genoa, the treaty, while a setback, was not a death sentence. It forced a strategic pivot. Unable to compete directly with Venetian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean, the Genoese increasingly turned their ambitions westward. They deepened their ties with Spain and Portugal, and their financiers became instrumental in funding the Iberian voyages of exploration that would eventually open up the Atlantic world and reshape global trade routes entirely. The Treaty of Turin, therefore, didn't just end a war, it silently redirected the flow of history. By forcing a negotiated balance instead of seeking total victory, it allowed two exhausted competitors to survive, recover, and ultimately thrive in different, world-changing ways. It stands as a timeless lesson in the art of the possible, demonstrating that the greatest strategic wisdom often lies not in winning the battle, but in knowing when to make a deal that allows everyone to keep playing the game. What becomes truly striking when we step back from these 25 individual stories is the realization of just how sophisticated and nuanced medieval statecraft actually was. We often picture this era as one dominated by the clash of steel and the roar of siege engines, a time when might made right and power was taken, not given. But these silent treaties reveal a completely different truth. They show us a world where rulers, even the most powerful and ambitious, understood the immense value of calculated restraint. They recognized that a kingdom bled dry by perpetual warfare was a weak kingdom, no matter how many battles it won. The truly lasting victories, the ones that built dynasties and defined civilizations for centuries, were more often secured in the quiet of a council chamber than in the chaos of a battlefield. This wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the ultimate expression of strategic foresight. One of the most powerful and recurring tools in this diplomatic arsenal was the strategic marriage alliance. We saw it with Alfred the Great binding Wessex and Mercia together against the Vikings, and again with the Treaty of Windsor weaving Portugal and England into the oldest alliance in history. These were not mere romantic unions or simple peace offerings. They were brilliant, long-term geopolitical investments. A dynastic marriage was a living treaty, a biological contract that merged bloodlines, territories, and military resources for generations. It created a vested interest in peace between two families, transforming a potential enemy into a relative. This practice turned the royal family tree into a veritable map of international relations, where a cousin could be a more reliable ally than a sworn oath. It was a way to expand influence and secure borders without ever drawing a sword, proving that the cradle could be just as effective as the castle in building an empire. Equally potent was the shrewd use of economic incentives. Medieval rulers were keenly aware that wealth was the lifeblood of power, and they learned to wield commerce as a weapon of peace. The Treaty of Nymphaeum stands as a masterclass in this approach, where Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII traded exclusive trading rights for the naval power needed to reclaim Constantinople. He didn't pay for an army with gold from his treasury. He paid for it with future economic potential, outsourcing his military needs to a commercial partner. Similarly, the Peace of Stralsund saw the Hanseatic League use its economic might to literally purchase control over Danish sound tolls and fortresses, achieving through financial pressure what would have required a fleet of warships. These agreements demonstrate a profound understanding of soft power, the idea that controlling trade routes and treasuries could be far more decisive and far less costly than controlling territory through force. It was a realization that the most effective siege could be an economic blockade, and the most valuable victory could be a monopoly. Furthermore, these treaties highlight the indispensable role of external mediation in resolving seemingly intractable conflicts. Time and again, when two proud rulers found themselves at a bloody stalemate, a third party was needed to provide the face-saving framework for a compromise. The papacy often played this role, as it did with the Concordat of Worms, where the Pope helped separate spiritual and temporal authority to end the investiture controversy, and at Trenčín, where his legates brokered a peace between Bohemia and Poland. A powerful external mediator could offer something the warring parties could not: impartiality. They could suggest solutions that would be seen as a humiliation if proposed by the opponent directly, and they could lend the moral or spiritual authority of their office to legitimize a difficult compromise. This practice established a crucial precedent for international arbitration, showing that even the most bitter enemies could find a path to peace with the help of a trusted and neutral intermediary. Beyond preventing wars, these silent agreements were also remarkable engines of progress. They didn't just create an absence of conflict, they actively fostered an environment where culture, law, and commerce could flourish. The Peace of Constance, by granting autonomy to Italian cities, directly unleashed the creative and commercial energies that would fuel the Renaissance. The Laws of Oleron, by standardizing maritime practices, created the legal security that enabled a massive expansion of sea trade. The Treaty of Calais provided Poland with the prolonged stability needed for Casimir the Great to enact his sweeping internal reforms and found a university. By choosing negotiation over destruction, these treaties protected the very foundations of civilization: the merchants, the artists, the scholars, and the legal frameworks that are always the first casualties of war. They proved that diplomacy is not merely the art of avoiding the worst, but also the craft of building the best possible future. The legacy of these silent treaties is therefore not just a list of averted battles, but the very shape of our modern world, from the borders of our nations to the principles of our international law. From the Treaty of Verdun, which first carved the rough shapes of modern Europe out of Charlemagne's empire, to the Treaty of Turin, which established a fragile but essential balance between the exhausted maritime giants of Venice and Genoa, these 25 agreements reveal a stunning truth about the medieval world. The map of power was not drawn by the sword alone. It was often drafted by scribes, negotiated by envoys, and sealed with marriages, trade privileges, and brilliantly face-saving compromises. These silent treaties were the subtle instruments that rulers used to expand their influence, secure their borders, and avoid the ruinous cost of open warfare, proving that the most durable victories are often those won without a single life lost on the battlefield. This journey through the quiet chambers of medieval diplomacy offers us more than just fascinating history. It provides a timeless toolkit for understanding power and conflict resolution. The strategic marriage alliances, like the one that united Portugal and England for over 6 centuries, teach us about the enduring strength of bonds built on mutual interest and trust. The economic bargains, such as the one that allowed the Byzantine Empire to reclaim its capital with Genoa's ships, show us how resources and opportunities can be leveraged to achieve goals that seem impossible through force alone. And the painstakingly negotiated compromises, like the Peace of Constance that gave Italian cities the freedom to spark the Renaissance, remind us that acknowledging the core needs of all parties is the surest path to a lasting and prosperous peace. As we navigate our own complex world of global tensions and seemingly intractable conflicts, these medieval lessons feel surprisingly fresh. They remind us that true leadership is not about total victory, but about the wisdom to seek stability over domination, the courage to make pragmatic concessions, and the foresight to build structures that can endure long after the negotiators are gone. The silent treaties of the Middle Ages whisper to us across the centuries, urging us to look beyond the obvious clash of arms and to appreciate the profound, quiet power of the pen, the promise, and the shrewdly struck deal. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into history's hidden turning points, feel free to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the past. We'd love to hear which of these silent treaties you found most fascinating. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, thank you for watching.